Welcome back to part 2 of chapter 2, where we now enter one of the most powerful intellectual and literary movements in American history, Transcendentalism. Emerging in the 1830s, in New England, Transcendentalism wasn't just a movement. It was a revolt. A philosophical and spiritual resistance to the cold logic of the Enlightenment and the rigid doctrines of Unitarianism. At its heart, it championed a simple yet radical idea that truth lives within. The Transcendentalists believed in the inherent goodness of the individual, the divinity of nature, and the authority of inner intuition over any church, government, or book. This was the first truly American intellectual movement, and it shaped not only literature, but education, architecture, politics, and even environmental thought. The leading figures? Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, of course, but also Margaret Fuller, a pioneering feminist voice, and Bronson Alcott, an educational reformer. Together, they spoke of self-reliance, nonconformity, and spiritual freedom, values that echo across American thought to this day. And at the center of it all was the publication, The Dial. Launched in July 1840 as a journal in a new spirit, The Dial gave Transcendentalism its voice. It was born from a group known as the Hedge Club, a gathering of thinkers like Emerson, Theodore Parker, and Frederick Hedge, who were tired of being rejected by mainstream journals like the North American Review. The first editor was Margaret Fuller, a bold and brilliant mind who helped shape the journal's tone and vision. George Ripley managed its early publication, and later Emerson himself took over editorial duties, refining its role as the literary home of the movement. Though the Dial only ran from 1840 to 1844, its influence was immense. It published essays, criticism, and poetry that encouraged Americans to think independently, to turn inward, and to build a culture not in Europe's image, but in their own. This journal wasn't just ink on paper. It was the heartbeat of Transcendentalism, and it helped pave the road to the American Renaissance. Let's take a moment to recognize Margaret Fuller, one of the boldest voices of American Transcendentalism and one of the very first American feminists. Born in 1810, Fuller was a scholar, critic, and editor who broke through the educational limits imposed on women. As the first editor of The Dial, she helped shape Transcendentalist thought from the inside. Her book Woman in the 19th Century, published in 1845, made a radical claim: women should be free to pursue education, careers, even become sea captains if they will. She was also the first female war correspondent in American journalism, and though her life ended tragically in a shipwreck, her words still sail forward. Sharp, fearless, and decades ahead of their time. Let's begin with the philosopher who gave American thought its spiritual backbone, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Born in 1803, Emerson started out as a Unitarian minister, but after the death of his wife and a deep crisis of faith, he left the pulpit in 1832 and turned inward, toward intuition, nature, and personal truth. His essay Nature, published in 1836, was a turning point. Emerson declared that the natural world is not just scenery, but divine revelation. The next year, in The American Scholar, he urged Americans to stop imitating Europe and think for themselves. Oliver Wendell Holmes later called it America's intellectual declaration of independence. In his essays, especially Self-Reliance, The Oversoul and Experience, Emerson calls on the individual to trust their inner voice, because that, he believed, is where truth lives. Nature and soul, spirit and matter. In Emerson's universe, they aren't separate. They are one. Let's now slow down and enter the quiet revolution of Emerson's mind. His essay Nature, published in 1836, and widely seen as the founding text of American Transcendentalism. This wasn't a loud book. There were no headlines. But it quietly shifted the way a generation would think about spirit, matter, self, and the sacred. Emerson had left the pulpit. He had lost faith in institutions, in inherited religion, and in material progress. In nature, he wrote his answer, not in protest, but in vision. He offered a universe where the divine is not distant, but present within the leaf, the river, the soul. Though critics would mock his circle as the Transcendental Club, and though the term Transcendentalism began as an insult in an 1837 review of Nature, Emerson stood at the movement's core. He writes, "The true philosopher and the true poet are one, and a beauty which is truth and a truth which is beauty is the aim of both." In Emerson's eyes, modern man had become distracted, blinded by duty, routine, and society's noise. To see clearly again, one needed solitude. Not just physical solitude, but spiritual stillness. He explains, "To go into solitude, a man needs to retire as much from his chamber as from society. I am not solitary whilst I read and write, though nobody is with me. But if a man would be alone, let him look at the stars." Nature is divided into 8 sections: nature, commodity, beauty, language, discipline, idealism, spirit, and prospects. Each explores how nature is not merely scenery, but a mirror of the human soul. He writes, "Nature, in its ministry to man, is not only the material, but is also the process and the result." And then, in one of the most beautiful ecological metaphors of the century, he reminds us, "The wind sows the seed, the sun evaporates the sea, the wind blows the vapor to the field, the ice on the other side of the planet condenses rain on this. The rain feeds the plant feeds the animal, and thus the endless circulations of the divine charity nourish man." In this view, nature is not static, it's not fixed. It's a living symbol of spirit, shaped by our perception and intuition. He declares, "Nature is not fixed but fluid. Spirit alters, molds it. Know then that the world exists for you. For you is the phenomenon perfect." This is not just philosophy. It's a call to wake up, to step outside, to see again, and to remember that the universe is alive, responsive, and waiting to be read, like a book written in light and leaf and wind. With nature, Emerson gives us more than an essay. He gives us a map, a spiritual guide to beauty, to unity, and to the divine presence in the everyday world. In the summer of 1837, Ralph Waldo Emerson stood before the Phi Beta Kappa Society at Harvard and delivered what would become a landmark moment in American intellectual history. His speech, titled "The American Scholar." It wasn't just a lecture, it was a call to arms. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. would later describe it as America's intellectual declaration of independence, a bold rejection of cultural imitation and passive scholarship. Emerson challenged his audience to rise beyond pedantry, imitation, and blind reverence for European models. He warned, "The scholar is that man who must take up into himself all the ability of the time, all the contributions of the past, all the hopes of the future." He wanted not bookworms but thinkers, not parrots but creators. He called for a new kind of scholar, man thinking, rather than a mere echo of inherited knowledge. He named 3 vital influences on the scholar: nature as the wellspring of spiritual insight, books as tools to be questioned, not worshipped, and action as the necessary bridge between thought and life. A year later, in 1838, he would go even further. At Harvard's Divinity School, Emerson delivered an address that shocked his audience. In it, he rejected the institutional authority of the church, challenged the divinity of Jesus, and urged a return to the inner moral sense as the true source of religion. He said, "The soul knows no persons. It invites every man to expand to the full circle of the universe." His words enraged Harvard's religious elite. and led to his decades-long estrangement from the university. But in that alienation, Emerson found liberation. He became the spiritual architect of American Transcendentalism, and the Divinity School address solidified his belief that truth is personal, direct, and intuitive, not handed down, but discovered within. Together, these two speeches redefined the American mind, breaking from the past and reaching inward for the divine. In 1841, Emerson published one of his most enduring essays, Self-Reliance. It is not a quiet piece, it is a fiery manifesto, a bold anthem for the soul. With unwavering conviction, Emerson declares, "Trust thyself, every heart vibrates to that iron string." He asks us to stop looking outward for validation, tradition, or conformity, and instead to turn inward, to honor the still, small voice within. For Emerson, that voice is not ego. It is intuition, the divine whisper of the soul. He warns us against the hypnotic pull of social approval and the pressure to remain consistent with our past. "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds," he writes, mocking those who cling to outdated beliefs out of fear. Instead, he urges courage. The courage to contradict ourselves, to evolve, to say something new tomorrow, even if it embarrasses what we said yesterday. Speak what you think now in hard words, and tomorrow speak what tomorrow thinks in hard words again. In one of his most metaphysical passages, he calls cause and effect the chancellors of God. Not distant laws of nature, but inner rhythms guiding us toward purpose. Society, he says, is a conspiracy against the soul, trying to make us obedient, agreeable, and safe. But true greatness lies in being misunderstood. To be great is to be misunderstood, he reminds us, placing us in the company of Socrates, Jesus, Luther, and Galileo. Self-reliance is not just an essay. It's a spiritual rebellion, a call to reclaim authorship of your own life, to abandon imitation, and to walk with boldness in the light of your own truth. Emerson doesn't offer comfort. He offers liberation. In his later years, Ralph Waldo Emerson evolved into more than just a writer. He became a national sage. The radical fire of his youth mellowed into a quieter, deeper humanism, yet the flame never died. His Representative Men, published in 1849, offered vivid portraits of intellectual giants, Plato, Shakespeare, Napoleon, not as unreachable idols, but as symbols of human potential. In English Traits and the Conduct of Life, Emerson reflected more on history, action, and spiritual practice, balancing vision with lived wisdom. But it's in the Oversoul, written earlier in 1841, that we glimpse the heart of Emerson's metaphysical world. He writes, "The soul is not a function, like the power of memory or calculation, but a light, a glory, a revelation." Here Emerson reaches toward the infinite. Drawing from Vedanta, Swedenborg, and Neoplatonism, he speaks of the soul as eternal, divine, and interconnected, a part of God and of every other soul. We live in succession, in division, in parts, in particles. Meantime, within man is the soul of the whole, the eternal one. He invites us to shed the ego and recognize that within us resides the universal spirit, not as theology, but as experience. And in The Poet, published in 1844, Emerson turns his attention to the one who can give form to this truth. Man is only half himself, the other half is his expression. The poet, to Emerson, is not just a writer of verses. He is a seer, someone who speaks the unspeakable, who sees the divine in daily life and gives it voice. He calls for an American bard to sing of the land's raw, unfinished beauty, of its stumps, its politics, its rivers, and indigenous people. This longing, so clear and prophetic, would find its answer in Walt Whitman, who Emerson would soon champion. And as Emerson closes the poet, he reminds us, wherever snow falls or water flows or birds fly, there is beauty, plenteous as rain. Not decoration, not luxury, but revelation. Poetry, like the soul, is how we become whole. Ralph Waldo Emerson was more than a philosopher. He was a seer poet, a voice of the invisible, translating the infinite into verse. Though best remembered for his essays, Emerson's poetry, found in collections like Poems published in 1846 and Mayday and other pieces in 1867, bears the soul of Transcendentalism. His lines may lack metrical polish, but they shine with visionary force. In the Rhodora, he writes, "If eyes were made for seeing, then beauty is its own excuse for being." Here, nature's mystery speaks without purpose, yet holds divine intent. His conquered hymn gave the revolution its immortal echo. The shot heard round the world. In Brahma, drawing from Hindu philosophy, Emerson breaks the binaries of life and death, self and other. I am the doubter and the doubt, and I the hymn the Brahmin sings. This is Emerson at his most mystical, bridging east and west, body and spirit. His poems, Uriel and Merlin, take us into realms of myth and metaphysics where cosmic truths flicker beneath the surface of form. To Emerson, the true poet was no mere craftsman, but a liberating god, a prophet of the eternal. The poet is the sayer, the namer, and represents beauty. Though his later years saw a decline in intellectual sharpness, the foundations had already been laid. By his death in 1882, Emerson had become the sage of Concord, revered, quoted, canonized. But what he truly gave us was more than words. He offered a philosophy of inner light, a belief in the divine spark within, a legacy of self-trust, of soul over system. He didn't just influence American literature, he helped create it. So that brings us to the end of Ralph Waldo Emerson's journey. But before we close, let me share how important he's been in the past 5 years of UGC NET papers. He's not just mentioned in theory, he's showing up in questions. First, remember the chronological order type. He's frequently listed alongside Thoreau, Whitman, Dickinson, and Robert Frost. And it's essential to know Emerson comes first among them. Another question focused on his short treatise on Transcendentalism, specifically drawn from nature. They asked about his definition of a true philosopher and poet, quoting that powerful line, "The true philosopher and the true poet are one, and a beauty which is truth, and a truth which is beauty, is the aim of both." That came directly from nature, again proving how central that text is. One question came from Self-Reliance, focusing on cause and effect as the chancellors of God. Emerson's unique way of explaining internal moral laws, and of course one more question quoted this unforgettable line, "Trust thyself, every heart vibrates to that iron string." So if you ever wondered whether Emerson still matters in your exam, he does. Know him well, and you've already secured 2 to 4 marks. Let's carry this energy forward as we move into our next transcendentalist, Henry David Thoreau. A man who didn't just write about ideas, he lived them. Born in 1817 and mentored by Ralph Waldo Emerson, Thoreau took the ideals of Transcendentalism, intuition, self-reliance, spiritual simplicity, and tested them in real life. His most famous work, Walden, published in 1854, is a beautiful mix of memoir and philosophy written during his 2 years living in a cabin by Walden Pond. It wasn't just about nature. It was about clarity, conscience, and escaping the noise of society. But Thoreau didn't just withdraw. He resisted. In Civil Disobedience, published in 1849, he called out slavery and the Mexican-American War, arguing that when laws are unjust, we must follow our conscience, not the state. He wrote powerful essays like Walking, A Winter Walk, and Wild Apples, each blending natural beauty with moral insight. Though he published little in his lifetime, Thoreau's influence today is massive. From Gandhi to Martin Luther King Jr., in him, the transcendental ideal truly walked off the page and into the world. Let's step into the stillness of Walden Pond. Not just a place on a map, but a metaphor for the soul. In 1854, Thoreau published Walden, or Life in the Woods, a book that has become one of the most enduring meditations on simplicity, nature, and personal freedom. For 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days, Thoreau lived alone in a small cabin he built himself on land owned by his mentor, Ralph Waldo Emerson. But this was no retreat into silence. It was an act of protest, a spiritual experiment, and a declaration of independence. Through prose that is as clear as the pond he so lovingly describes, Thoreau charts the freeze and thaw of the seasons, the shifting colors of the sky, and the behavior of plants and animals. He even measures the pond's depth with string and records it with scientific precision. But Walden isn't a nature diary. It's a mirror, reflecting the soul of the reader. He critiques the artificial demands of modern life, mocks the obsession with wealth and status, and dares us to simplify. He writes, "I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability of man to elevate his life by a conscious endeavor." This sentence is the heartbeat of the book. What Thoreau offers is a guide, not for escaping the world, but for living deliberately in it. Walden remains a cornerstone of transcendental thought, and its influence echoes in everything from environmentalism to minimalist living. It teaches that to truly find yourself, you must first step outside the noise and listen to the world that waits in quiet. Let's now turn to a different kind of protest. Not through banners or marches, but through silence, stillness, and the refusal to comply. In 1849, Henry David Thoreau published a brief but revolutionary essay titled Resistance to Civil Government, today better known as Civil Disobedience. At its heart lies a simple, powerful idea that when the government becomes unjust, the individual must break the law, peacefully but firmly. Thoreau wasn't theorizing from a distance. He had refused to pay the poll tax, a protest against the American government's support of slavery and the Mexican-American War. For this, he was jailed, briefly. But that confinement became a moment of clarity. In that cell, he realized the state never intentionally confronts a man's sense, intellectual or moral, but only his body. He writes, "Under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is also a prison. This is not defiance for its own sake. It is a moral imperative. To cooperate with injustice, even passively, is to become part of it." But Thoreau's resistance wasn't about chaos or rebellion. It was rooted in conscience, the core of the self that cannot be legislated. He believed that laws have no sanctity unless they align with moral truth. And when they do not, silence is betrayal. This small essay, so personal, so quiet, would ripple across history. It would echo in the voice of Gandhi, in the dream of Martin Luther King Jr., in every peaceful protest born from conscience, not violence. Civil disobedience is not just political theory. It's a guide for how to live truthfully in a world that often demands compromise. For Thoreau, resistance is not the exception. It is the responsibility of a just soul. In the final chapter of his life, Henry David Thoreau transformed from a quiet philosopher of the woods into one of the boldest moral voices of his era. He was no longer just observing nature or writing about solitude. He was confronting the nation's deepest wounds. In the 1850s, Thoreau became an unflinching critic of slavery, speaking out in fiery essays like Slavery in Massachusetts and A Plea for Captain John Brown. His defense of Brown, whom many saw as a violent extremist, was not just controversial, it was radical. But for Thoreau, the issue was simple. When justice is at stake, silence is a crime. He didn't just speak. He acted. Thoreau quietly supported the Underground Railroad, helping fugitive slaves find their path to freedom. His actions matched his words, and his moral compass never wavered. Yet, despite his passion and his pen, the world around him remained indifferent. A week on the Concord and Merrimack rivers barely sold. Even Walden, now considered a classic, was largely ignored. In 1862, Thoreau died at the age of 44. His health weakened, his spirit weathered, and his genius mostly unrecognized. But time, as it often does, rewrote his story. Today, we don't just remember Thoreau as a man who lived in the woods. We remember him as someone who dared to live according to his conscience, who saw nature not as escape, but as truth, who challenged the machinery of injustice not with noise, but with conviction. Henry David Thoreau left behind more than books. He left behind a blueprint for how to live with purpose, how to resist with dignity, and how to see the world not as it is, but as it ought to be. Before we move ahead, let's quickly anchor Thoreau in your UGC NET prep. Like Emerson, he's often part of chronological sequence questions. So remember, Emerson came first, then Thoreau, and then Whitman. Now, one repeated question is from his essay Civil Disobedience, where you're asked what he learned from that one night in jail. The two correct takeaways: the state is ultimately weak, and neighbors are only friendly during fair weather. Another popular format is Match the Following, linking Thoreau to his major works like Walden, Civil Disobedience, Walking, and A Plea for Captain John Brown. So yes, don't just read Thoreau, connect him across genres, themes, and timelines. Walt Whitman, often called the father of American free verse, reshaped the very foundation of poetry, not just in America, but across the literary world. His life's masterpiece, Leaves of Grass, first self-published in 1855 and revised throughout his life, broke away from rigid meters and lofty classical illusions. Instead, it embraced the living, breathing spirit of a diverse America. Born in Long Island and raised in Brooklyn, Whitman left school at 11 and moved through many jobs. Journalist, printer, teacher, until poetry became his true calling. Leaves of Grass celebrated the human body, the working class, and the soul of democracy. Though initially dismissed for its sensuality and lack of form, it later became a sacred text of American literature. The Civil War deepened Whitman's vision. He nursed soldiers in hospitals, and from that sorrow emerged some of his most powerful elegies. "O Captain, my Captain," and "When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed." Whitman saw the poet as both prophet and people's voice, fusing personal experience with collective identity. By the time of his death in 1892, he was not just a poet. He was the pulse of a nation finding its voice. Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass is not just a book. It's a breathing, growing testament to the American soul. First published anonymously in 1855 as a slim volume of 12 free verse poems, it defied the traditions of European verse with radical boldness. Gone were the metered lines and courtly theme. In their place, a sprawling, sensual, democratic voice that declared the body holy, the self divine, and America a poem in motion. In Song of Myself and I Sing the Body Electric, Whitman exalts the sacredness of the individual, fusing spiritual vitality with physical joy. He writes, not from above, but from beside us. His voice intimate, his gaze boundless. His I becomes a national self, at once personal and collective. He catalogues laborers, lovers, landscapes, not to define them, but to dissolve the barriers between them. This was revolutionary. Critics at the time recoiled. The verse was called obscene, unpoetic. But Whitman pressed on. Leaves of Grass would evolve across 9 editions, absorbing his life and times into its pages. The Calamus poems explored male-male intimacy with emotional depth and erotic candor. Drum taps, born from the Civil War, mourned a wounded nation and honored its lost leader. None more famously than in the elegy, "O Captain, my Captain," or the haunting "When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed." Though the early editions were scorned and censored, by the end of his life, Whitman was embraced as a prophet of modern poetry. Leaves of Grass had become not just a collection, but a living text, growing with the poet and echoing with the heartbeat of a democracy still finding its voice. Song of Myself is the roaring heart of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, a poem without fences, a meditation without end. Here, the I is not confined by biography. It is Whitman, yes, but also you, me, all of us. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you, he declares in the opening line, an intimate handshake across time and space. This I stretches and dissolves, crossing borders of race, gender, and class. In section 20, he writes, "In all people I see myself, none more and not one a barleycorn less. And the good or bad I say of myself, I say of them." The poet is a mirror, and the reader becomes reflection. Whitman celebrates birth and death with the same breath. I pass death with the dying and birth with the new washed babe, and am not contained between my hat and boots. That's section 7, where the soul outgrows the body and identity becomes boundless. In section 47, he turns to us directly. "It is you talking just as much as myself. I act as the tongue of you." This is no monologue. It is communion. We are not mere readers. We are participants. Then that iconic line. Section 51. "Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes." It's not an apology. It's a declaration of the self in all its mystery, messiness, and majesty. Critic Alice L. Cook sees the self as both individual and universal. John B. Mason calls the poem a transcendence from the singular to the cosmic. Whitman saw the leaf as heroic, the grass as epic. And in doing so, he crowned the ordinary with poetic divinity. Song of Myself is not just a poem. It's an open road. And once you start walking it, you'll find yourself in every line. Walt Whitman's "When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed" is more than an elegy. It is a sacred hymn to sorrow. Written after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and first published in sequel to Drum Taps in 1865, the poem carries the weight of national mourning. But Whitman doesn't offer just tribute. He offers transcendence. 3 symbols guide us through this journey. The lilac, blooming by the door, becomes a sign of enduring love. Its fragrance lingers, even in grief. The western star, Venus, hangs low in the evening sky, a celestial reminder of the fallen Lincoln. And the hermit thrush, singing alone in the woods, becomes the voice of solitude, of spiritual solace, of a grief that sings instead of screams. As the funeral train moves slowly across America's landscape, Whitman transforms it into a vessel of collective loss. Yet even as the poem travels through cities and fields, it retreats inward, into the hush of the woods, into the stillness of death. Listen closely to the bird's song. "Come lovely and soothing death, undulate round the world, serenely arriving." Death, for Whitman, is not a terror but a rhythm, a necessary wave in the sea of life. Through pathetic fallacy, nature moans alongside us. Trees bow, stars dim, lilacs bloom with aching beauty. This isn't just a poem for Lincoln, it's a poem for every loss. It offers us peace not by denying death, but by placing it in harmony with the eternal return of spring. When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed whispers, grief can flower, mourning can sing, and death, too, belongs to the earth we love. Walt Whitman's Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking, first published as A Child's Reminiscence, is not just a poem, it's a memory, a rite of passage, a soul awakening. Set along the shore, This haunting elegy tells the story of a boy, perhaps Whitman himself, who watches a pair of mockingbirds by the sea. One day, the female vanishes, and the male, now alone, sings again and again a song of longing, of grief, of love that cannot be answered. That cry, that sorrow reaches into the boy, and something shifts. Loss, once distant, becomes real, and from that pain, poetry is born. Through symbols, the endlessly rocking sea, the lonely bird, the listening child, Whitman captures the precise moment when a child becomes a poet. When feeling turns into voice, he writes not with rhyme, but with rhythm. Not with form, but with feeling. And the sea, always moving, becomes the great teacher, whispering, chanting, reminding him, death, 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 but not as an end, number, as a beginning, as the source of song, because as Whitman shows us, grief is the mother of poetry. Memory is its cradle. In this one poem, Whitman gives us the very heartbeat of Leaves of Grass, where nature teaches, pain transforms, and the soul learns to speak. Walt Whitman's O Captain, My Captain is unlike anything else he ever wrote. No sprawling, free verse, no wandering self, instead rhyme, meter, structure. A controlled vessel for uncontrollable grief. Published just months after Abraham Lincoln's assassination, this poem became Whitman's most public elegy. The captain is Lincoln. The ship is the nation. The voyage, bloody and perilous, is the Civil War. And though the ship reaches port safe and sound, the captain lies fallen cold and dead. That refrain, so simple, so final, echoes through the poem like a bell tolling over still waters. Whitman, who had always written to celebrate life, now writes to mourn its loss. He steps away from his usual voice, not to abandon it, but to meet a mourning nation where it stood. The poem's formal rhyme scheme feels like a flag folded with trembling hands. The tight structure reflects a desperate attempt to impose order on chaos, on grief, on death. But at its heart, O Captain, My Captain is about the unbearable irony. Victory is here, but the leader who led us is not. For once, Whitman doesn't sing the self, he sings the people. He sings all of us, mourning together on the shore, watching the ship and whispering the words, O Captain, My Captain, our fearful trip is done. Walt Whitman's Drum Taps, published in 1865, is not just a book of poems. It's a nation's open wound, stitched together by verse, written during the American Civil War and printed just weeks after Lincoln's assassination. These poems bear witness to both carnage and compassion. Whitman, who had tended to wounded soldiers in makeshift hospitals, poured into poetry what he couldn't heal with his hands. In beat, beat, drums, the call to arms is relentless. Blow, bugles, blow. The poem shatters peace, invades churches, schools, homes. War is no longer distant. It knocks on every door. Later, in O Captain, My Captain, grief takes form. Structured, formal, but heavy with pain. It was added in the sequel to Drum Taps alongside 17 other poems that turned personal mourning into public memory. But Whitman doesn't stop at sorrow. In I Hear America Singing, he envisions a hopeful choir of ordinary lives. Mechanics, mothers, carpenters, all singing their part. This isn't silence after battle. It's the music of resilience. Yet, that harmony wasn't whole. Decades later, Langston Hughes responded with I Too Sing America, reminding us Whitman's America didn't yet include every voice. Drum Taps is Whitman's evolution. From celebrant of the self to chronicler of suffering to profit of a better, braver union. This was not the end of Leaves of Grass. It was its heartbeat, louder, darker, and more human. So that brings us to the end of Walt Whitman, and with him, the close of part 2 of chapter 2. But before we move on, let's pause and look at what the UGC NET exam has actually asked about him in the past 5 years. Chronology is key. You'll often be asked to place authors in the correct timeline. Remember this: Emerson comes first, followed by Thoreau, then Whitman, and after him, Emily Dickinson and Robert Frost. The second question that repeatedly shows up is from "O Captain, My Captain." It's a tribute to Abraham Lincoln, a rare poem where Whitman uses rhyme and meter to express collective mourning. The third question was an identification one, asking you to name the 2 previous titles of the poem, Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking, which originally appeared as A Child's Reminiscence and was later retitled A Word Out of the Sea. The final version found its home in the sea, drift section of Leaves of Grass. So in total, just 3 questions from Whitman in 5 years. But when they come, they're deep cuts focused on title, history, dedication, and chronology. That's all for part 2. In the next segment, we'll explore Emily Dickinson, Mark Twain, the Fireside Poets, and Louisa May Alcott, voices that shaped the next wave of American literature. Stay tuned, because this journey only gets richer from here.